Ricordo il giorno che siamo partiti per il nostro viaggio. Anche se è stato molto tempo fa. Già allora avevamo grandi obiettivi. Volevamo contribuire al progresso del nostro paese e renderlo un posto sempre migliore. E ci siamo impegnati ogni giorno per farlo. Come in tutti i viaggi, strada facendo il nostro bagaglio si è riempito. Di ricordi, di emozioni, di esperienza. Ogni persona che abbiamo incontrato ha contribuito a rendere la nostra squadra più forte. Passo dopo passo abbiamo camminato sempre più veloce per avvicinarci al futuro. Dopo 60 anni il nostro percorso continua insieme. Verso un domani migliore. 60 anni di futuro e di energia.
Perché l'aspettavano così?
Perché credo in quello che dico.
Questo e basta?
Sì.
Don Giussani ha generato un popolo e io faccio parte di questo popolo.
L'avvenimento in cui Dio entra nella nostra esistenza e tutti, colpiti da una curiosità, sospendono per un istante l'ora e guardano dalla parte da cui viene il grido.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
o quando dice
when he says, what profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? Thus entered in the world the meaning of respect, veneration, attachment, love, trust, responsibility of the person. Love for man, for the person. Without this, Christianity cannot be understood. But perhaps we ourselves do not even understand while living it, while trying to live Christianity, because we do not participate in its origin. Christianity was not born for the sake of founding religion. It was born as a passion for the person. Then we can understand it. If he spoke of the Father, if he spoke of the child, if he attended his gaze with special care towards the sick, towards the poor, it was because the poor, the child, the sick were the most defenseless among all people. Those who could least impose themselves. But for that very reason, he asserted their presence, because their value was independent of their capacity for power. I repeat, the son of his mother and his father, love for the person, veneration for the person, tenderness for the person, passion for the person, absolute esteem for the person. We have just listened to the video. We have listened to the video of the intervention of Don Luigi Giussani of the 1985 meeting, and from which we have extracted the title of this meeting after 100 years from his birth. And I also note that through your presence and through your testimony, we document his presence today. We thank His Eminence Cardinal Matteo Maria Zuppi, who's here with us today. Thank you. President of the Italian Episcopal Conference and Archbishop of Bologna. Thank you very much, Eminence, for having accepted our invitation. You, in a recent interview, said that Don Giussani was always searching for the truth within every experience without wanting to defend anything, and for every encounter, and sees everything as an encounter to discover something. And what do you remember of Giussani in particular, of the figure of Don Giussani? What do you remember? Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, for this dialogue, and for the beautiful Mass this morning, which was the essence from which we start everything, and from which this people on a journey in flesh and bones takes life. What do I remember of Don Giussani? Well, first of all, his passion. To feel from him, to hear him talk about passion for man was something that you believed in. It was credible. It was believable. It was a desire to encounter people. Something that absolutely was inextinguishable and was irreducible as you often say. Irreducible. And maybe the last time that I saw him, and in that beautiful speech that he gave on Pentecost to all the movements with Pope John Paul II, when he was already quite old, and he spoke about beggars, about being beggars. This expressed a passion for everyone. And also the second thing is a great attentiveness towards others. The encounter was not something standard or repeated. It was an event in this sense of something creative, which generated other things, which was generative. And these are the two things that I treasure the most about Don Giussani. In 1981, very recently, a new book by Roberto Zuccolini has just been published on two communities between the dialogue between Cardinal Martini and the community of Saint Egidio. And at this time in 1981, Cardinal Martini spoke to Giussani. He was president of Catholic Action, Azione Cattolica, and they began to discuss and talk. And it was clear, what was clear was the passion that Giussani had for a presence that was alive, that had to do an aliveness that was linked to everyday life, a passion for man transmitted through every detail of his life. I'd like to go deeper into this aspect. Within a passion for man, I think man has a need for this passion. Why does man have a need for this passion in order to live? Well, it is said that our generation is the generation of sad people. Oh, sad passions. Sad people are sad passions are passions that are completely devoid of the self. Passion for individualism, which I think within this digital revolution, we are just beginning to understand what a digital man, the digital man is. A passion for man is opposed to this because it helps me understand who I am through the encounter with others. It opens up individualism through the encounter with others. It is generative, creative. Passion is not something you carry out in a laboratory. I think through all of Don Giussani's life, there are technicians, laboratory technicians amongst you. And they must be very careful, they must be very precise, because clearly when life outside of the laboratory, well, we make mistakes and we are quite imprecise sometimes. And passion leads you to something which is not completely calculated and measured. But it is this passion, which has allowed for an encounter and therefore a departure from these sad passions and towards the encounter towards others. And we have a huge need for this. a while ago, we used to speak about the desertification of a spiritual desertification, a desert of the spirit. And we haven't really improved that much, we could say, but because we still see a lot of this desert of the spirit. But we must read all of this in more and more in light of this passion for man, because this spiritual desertification is very widespread now. And sometimes we think things are very impossible and difficult. These examples, I'll say one of them, Don Giussani. It has to do with Don Giussani. Tomorrow I will be talking about Pasolini's film, a movie on the Gospel according to Matthew. Giussani talked about Pasolini and recognized within him, and we're talking about the 60s here, which at that time Pasolini was not quite the most Catholic figure or well considered. If a very precise and person would have found this very, very strange, Giussani said, within what Pasolini said, he saw a passion for man. So what he did was understand this profound question, which is this desire. And Giussani was able to read this within Pasolini's work. And someone else might absolutely be scandalized by this link. But if we have a passion within us, then that's how we recognize a passion in front of us. And many people would have said or can say, no, that's wrong. You shouldn't be talking about that. The lab technician sees what doesn't work. And Giussani was able to see a hidden but present passion within Pasolini, for example. Eminence, even as a young priest, you, and then as a parish priest, and now as a bishop and now cardinal, you have always testimonied or witnessed to this passion for man, as Pope Francis said, in the peripheries of our society. And also in the center of our society. How did this passion develop within you? Well, it was through an encounter. All of this began, we could say, my family were two saints, my parents. They had a faith, and even they had very different cultural backgrounds, but were also complementary. My father was from Rome. He had a very affectionate faith. My mother was a little bit more pragmatic. She was from Milan, and she was very precise, very pragmatic and strict. But when I encountered the first people of the community of Saint Egidio, they said to me, we're going to be praying before going to school for morning prayer. And I said, well, you know what, I've already got my mother who prays in the morning. And then I decided to go, and I understood that it was something that I was encountering as something important for me. And then this aspect of encountering the peripheral as parts of our society, that we could say are that third world, which is hidden within our cities, which is still present. Perhaps now it is even more hidden than it used to be. At the end of the 60s, people used to live in hovels, and it was more evident. So this was my, we could say, encounter with a gospel that was alive, that had to do with all of life. And it was a passion that I felt, and it opened me up to the passion that I saw in front of me in others. So I'd like to take on a paradox here, pose a paradox here. So we have man with all his existential wounds, and man should be open to all of this passion. But in a certain sense, we have this great need. It's an urgency. It's something, but on the other hand, it is like we don't accept it and we don't allow ourselves to penetrate these issues. How do you explain this paradox? Well, the gospel of today is narrated about a narrow door, as we said this morning. And going through this narrow door brings us closer to ourselves. We are continuously stimulated and asked to, we are invited to constantly grasp things around us and grab and take from others and instrumentalize the resources that we have around us. And we don't realize the many questions and the many signs of suffering that we see. And we don't even realize the signs of suffering within ourselves either. And the answer through sharing this suffering with others. We self-medicate very much. Our individualism makes us worry in an excessive way about our own self. And it is actually finding that passion and that encounter with the other helps me understand who I am. And I understand who I am. I think individualism convinces us, persuades us that it is only by ourselves we are much better off, safeguarding our own self. But there's nothing you can do. We encounter ourselves only through the sharing and a dialogue with others, and when we open up to others. In fact, you wrote a book. You will hate your companion, your neighbor, and you reflected on the fears of of today. Where do these fears originate from? I think that they have an origin within the isolated self, individualism, which gives the appearance of giving us a certain strength of affirming ourselves. Actually, it makes us very weak, and it fills us with fear and makes us look at others as if they are in competition with us, and that I cannot understand them. They become incomprehensible to me, and I try to defend myself from the other. And also, we are sort of intoxicated because individualism becomes a sort of a nationalism as well. A great I who defends many different isolated I's, where, on the contrary, it is through discovering the other. So, therefore, many fears originate from this fragility, the fact that we feel fragile and that we don't have the strength, and we don't cure this fragility through encountering others. The pandemic, in this sense, let's remember that it's not just a sanitary pandemic, but also the crisis of the war in this current climate. All of this should convince us, persuade us even more of the truth of all this. It is only through a common effort that we can really become ourselves. Pope Francis said in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, the saint is someone who's against everybody. And when I find someone who is on my side, it is like the amplification of myself. And the challenge is really to consider ourselves as a unity, as a brotherhood, the awareness that it is only together that we can improve and move along.
I would like to talk about knowing ourselves, knowing our fears, instead these fears that make us closed towards one another. The philosopher Sartre, in 1943, wrote a very famous book where he says, and I'm quoting, "Getting drunk by ourselves or leading peoples, when doing this, man is a useless passion." The exact opposite of what we're saying right now. And I'm saying this in my own words. You'll maybe say it better. How is it possible for man to be this, to neglect his own experience, to betray it? How can he be so far away from himself that he says something like this? How can man say that he himself is a useless passion? How can he be so far away from himself? Unfortunately, it is very possible. There are many factors that we have to take into account, and the digital man is the latest variant that we're starting to understand. It's possible because there's evil within us that isolates us. Evil exists. Sometimes it is more evident. We become used to war, horrible things. It's like the word isn't even about us. We think that it has nothing to do with us. We become used to it. Evil divides us from one another. It separates us. And therefore, a passion for man is the exact opposite of what evil causes, which is becoming ourselves by imposing ourselves on others. I would say almost a pornographic idea of life. Imposing ourselves, offending the weakness of others. We think that the weaker people are useless. We see them as useless. We start believing that they are not important, and these are all products of evil. Lack of love, sad passions. These passions are devoid of love. As the psalm says, that we don't really understand evil. Passion implies words such as suffering, sacrifice, compassion, empathy towards those who suffer? Is it possible to experience passion without these characteristics? Well, it would be the pornographic idea of love of life that I have just mentioned. The many versions of well-being that are offered to us. I think we are all healthy enough to think that, well, suffering is, of course, not a good thing, but suffering exists. Our sufferings exist. We have to face them. I empathize with those who suffer. When I went to Bologna after a few months, a young boy had died and he was 12 years old. I spoke about him, and after some time, his parents came up to me and told me, well, you made a mistake. Our son was not 12, he was 10 when he died. Then the father started crying and he said, I would have given my own life for him to be 12, to live enough to be 12 years old. This is love, this is passion. Another example. There was an episode in Civitanove Marche where a man from Nigeria was killed and his murder lasted 4 minutes. Sometimes I think, what would I have done? Maybe I would have been scared, wouldn't have done anything. Some people took out their phones, but even though that's part of the so-called pornographic idea of life, in my opinion. But what I think each one of us would have done, well, if that man had been our father, we would have attacked his murderer. We would have done something if that man had been our brother. Well, bottom line is that man is our brother. That man is my brother. Then I do something. That's our issue. It's an issue regarding love, lack of compassion, because without compassion we live for ourselves. We are made to love. And when we forget about this, life becomes something else. You touched upon a cultural change due to the digitalization, the digital revolution. And there's a famous scientist, Kirchhoff, who came to the meeting last year and who said, after Cambridge Analytica, we should have understood how much the public opinion is influenced by algorithms. Nonetheless, algorithms create divisions, separations, fake news, and polarized opinions that lead to the radicalization of public opinion, which is what you are saying. And then he says, the critical cognitive level is becoming lower and lower because of the impact of social media. Social media are questioning our opinions. Our critical thought doesn't develop anymore. We are experiencing one of the greatest crises of our history, epistemological crises of our history. And then he says, he asks a question that I would like to ask you. This is an open question. How can man go from an alphabetical culture to a digital culture without losing his own self? Well, there are many things in our experience. I have touched upon the digital man, artificial intelligence, the digital revolution. Using social media, the use of social media influences each one of us. Sometimes it's more evident. I search for something and casually I see ads regarding that specific thing. They want to catch my attention to take me where they want me to go. Algorithms have an impact on our lives. Sometimes we trust these algorithms, and then they are the ones who decide, who make decisions. When we are not passionate enough towards the others and towards God, we start trusting these algorithms maybe too much. This is a huge challenge. And something we should think about. Maybe you will think about this during this week. The passion that reached you will maybe help you generate other passions. When you don't have passions, you don't see anything. You don't notice anything. Or maybe you bite many things, but nothing satiates you. When you have a passion for man, then you notice things. Then maybe life becomes a bit too complicated. But I'm not seeing many sad people here. Quite the opposite. You made your life more difficult, but you don't seem sad. I think many of you do volunteer work. So maybe sometimes instead of going to see a football match or watching TV, or instead of going for a walk, you do something else. So it's a more complicated life, but it opened new doors for you. I see many Christians that impressed me, and that experience has now become some kind of intelligence. I've heard many stories of people trying to fulfill this passion. If I hadn't met someone who took me to the periphery of the city, I maybe would have done something else in my life, maybe sociological studies. But instead, what's important is to touch things. A passion for man is not something abstract. Someone who made their own life more difficult is actually someone who has found a passion. I'm here and I can do something. So if we truly live this passion for man, it becomes a way to properly use social media, other digital tools in our life. Yes, if we don't have a passion for man, then the algorithm wins. It guides us. It manipulates us. It makes us an object. the one who loves man the most that I know is our Lord. We cannot deny this. Man can find himself. And the passion for man is something that we can find by encountering Jesus Christ. Sometimes we think we're the one making decisions, but he is actually the one who decides. And we have to fight for our passion for man. We have to use it to fulfill our needs, to meet our needs, the needs we all have. Because if we are thirsty, it means there is water to be found. Yes, there is some kind of spiritual desert which causes many sufferings, of course, but the solution is this passion. So instead of running away and of living in this desert, we have to look for water, because many people are looking for it. The same thing Giussani said about Pasolini. Pasolini did not accept the standardization of man. He did not accept some kind of standard mainstream Christianity, the kind of Christianity that has all the answers. This is why Giussani was interested in Pasolini, because he saw him as a man who was searching for something. And we can do the same. It wasn't easy being a fan of Pasolini at the time. They were almost two opposite figures. But instead, passion means asking real questions, being free in asking questions.
Now, I won't cite Pasolini directly, but the famous cartoonist Charles Schulz, who in a drawing he made, there's a dialogue between Linus and Lucy, where Linus tells him that he'd like to be a doctor when he's older, and Lucy says, "You can never be a doctor because you don't love people." And Linus tells him, "Well, I love humanity, and it's people I can't put up with." And this makes me laugh a lot, but there's a lot of truth behind it. There's a lot of people who say, oh, we need to save the earth, save the world, make peace, but when it actually requires you to look at your own neighbor, that's when something changes. What would you say to Linus? Well, first I'd tell him that we all find ourselves in his situation, you know. We always end up like that myself, you know. I think that I knew someone who'd always be swearing, and I'd said, come on, please, mate, stop swearing so often. It's like, he's like, well, no, it's not me who swears. The other people, it's the other ones who make me swear. It's not my fault, he would tell me. So what does it mean for me? The passion for man, and in this, the Lord has really kind of thrown us in the deep end here. It's not what I want. It's not what I think. It's not a category I can decide, or something that creates less problems for me, or which I like, or whoever asks it in the correct way. Passion for man is how it is. You can't change it. There's no categories. even Mazzolari, who's a holy man, said something similar. You don't love poor people how they would like to be loved. You know, with all the problems one can have, you know, with internal contradictions, you know, I say it to myself first and foremost, you know, even others love us in a different way than what we'd want. It always gets back to the discussion of the pornographic life of the laboratory. We build our own ideals, but then we look at how life is. We look back at the lofty ideals we've set ourselves, and then we look at our neighbor. We look in the mirror, and you know, even sometimes it's worth looking yourself in the eyes. Sometimes you need to convince yourself every now and again that, you know, you're an idiot through and through at the end of the day, but you need to kind of take a look at yourself like that every now and again, you know, poke fun at yourself. It's something we've all got to do. You know, it's a bit of a healthy relativism, I'd say. And obviously, I'd say we're against relativism. Obviously, you know, to relativize everything to yourself isn't great, but, you know, even in the sense of just looking yourself in the mirror, you know, convincing yourself that you're an idiot, you know, you are who you are, let's just call it that way. But relativizing ourselves to others, the best way to do that is to kind of be rooted within ourselves with who we truly are, and to love the other for who they are deeply. For you, I think this is something Giussani touched upon. Pasolini and Giussani, even though this is a centenary even for Pasolini, he was born in 22 as well. You know, it's something physical. The flesh is this. We trust in a. Do we trust in a kind of idealized Christianity? Do we diffuse our own intelligence to a kind of faceless, historyless ideal that says nothing to anyone, that means nothing, and that is ultimately meaningless? Do we trust that? And do we trust a totally spiritualized Christianity that cannot be measured against concrete physical life? Thankfully for us, because we are who we are, and we're able to, you know, let's say, being loved for who we are, and this is what changes us. Because there's no abstract perfection to aim for. There's just the Lord who spent a few years of his life with some disciples. You know, he'd have probably fired them all if, you know, if after a little bit he'd stopped and he'd made a calculation of how convenient they all were. He probably would have thrown them all out immediately. I probably would have told him, look, okay, you need to do it this way, you need to do it different. Let's kind of start from scratch, back to zero. We're changed fundamentally by this attraction when other people see us like that, when we're treated as a human. So Giussani's passion for man is a truly educational passion. Today, educating kids is hard. Teaching them is quite difficult. I think it's much more difficult than it was even 10, 20 years ago. What does it mean today to have a passion for education in this kind of moment in history, looking at focusing on our kids today? It's quite the challenge, I'd say. I think even here we ought to, you know, first thing I think and most of us here aren't kids just looking around the room. I can't see very well because I've got a light in my face, but we've all been kids at some point or other, and many kids are here because the young people, because they've encountered something now. I don't know if Bernhard was right when he said that things are worse nowadays, things are more difficult nowadays. I don't know. If I think at how difficult I was as a kid 50 years ago, I think, you know, in terms of how prevalent there was, certain ideologies were going around, certain simplifications, certain issues going around, dogma being thrown around at that period. It's you know, it's not like things were masses easier, you know, or people were easier to kind of domesticate. You know, but we see that something has changed, something touched us, something spoke to us, a passion that we felt that's helped us understand what we previously didn't understand. It's helped us find what we were looking for. You know, maybe without, you know, preaching too much here, my main fear is that, you know, all of us, even young kids, you know, they need to have witnesses first and foremost, people who are trustworthy, who they can rely on, who are passionate of what they do, who can be followed, who dare to dream. You know, old people who dare to dream and look forward, and only when doing so, when they see this, do the young people begin to dream themselves. That you're not in a constant state of exams. That you show that there's more to life than just exams. You know, leaving from the laboratory I was talking about earlier, there's a million ways you can look at life, and then however things go, they go. But especially now, you know, in the now, that there's too much to do than to focus on exams. And we shouldn't replicate too many, you know, too many lessons. You can't really teach someone to play the game of life well. So we're nearing the end of our discussion here. So historically, the passion for man, which is Christianity, as Giussani defined it, it's historically been freeing. It freed people from slavery. It freed women. It freed people from fear. That the multitude of fears that existed in societies in history. It's ultimately been a force that changed history. And ultimately created a far more human social life, right to the point of creating a kind of well-being. Often this revolutionary factor is slipped under the rug. This history we're living right now, what we're going through, how can we react to this, the liberation that Christ brings, the freedom it brings? What's the role the church should play in communicating this freedom? Because there's, you know, the church, but we don't know if it's accepted or how it's perceived, this freedom-bringing mission. Yes, so certainly, you know, every now and again it can be misunderstood, but if the life we lead, you know, it speaks for itself, our actions. I'd answer with a kind of a wider vision of fraternity, in my opinion. I'd point to the encyclical Fratelli Tutti. You know, it's much bigger than just the people I live near, my friends, people of my race, of my culture, the people who I think have already been kind of educated. The Fratelli Tutti has an encompassing vision. I remember this encyclical because, you know, the pandemic and the other kind of what I call sub-pandemics, directly or indirectly, you know, think about how the war with everything that matters, everything relevant, you know, we risk adapting ourselves to this kind of situation of internal war, and now we start to, often people start seeing war as a solution, and I think that we have a deep well of humanity to draw on, and the vision Fratelli Tutti puts forward, and I think it's the only kind of true answer to these pandemics, the awareness of we're all being in the same boat. You know, it's been called kind of the room of the world, a common house, with all the issues and problems this brings, but we need to use this kind of passion for man to try and rebuild to a sense of unity that we can't take for granted. It's hard to it's hard to build that for people's selfishness, their fears. They want to look after themselves first, but I feel like the Fratelli Tutti, the brothers all, the encyclical's vision, you know, I think it makes a certain part, a big part of the experience of Christians, that it's a kind of universal brotherhood, that we're one big family, that we see in others, we see others as a brother, you know, as a companion on a journey, as Pope Benedict would put it. To find someone who otherwise, through isolation and fear, we wouldn't really know how to live otherwise if we subject ourselves to that fear. And that's kind of Fratelli Tutti's big picture vision. I think that's the answer, the most kind of far-reaching, long-term plan that involves us right now. The problems we're living through it covers all the contemporary dramatic issues. You know, they're very much real. It's not an abstract encyclical. We need to rediscover that this is life, not because we enjoy it, or often the opposite, because we live in a situation that's totally unique to any time in history. Because we can see compassion, we can try and bring that into us. And Fratelli Tutti is the great kind of reply that requires all of us to commit, to work together, even interreligious dialogue, that we'll be having an important a prominent Muslim figure coming to a talk tonight. Yes, this dialogue often reinforces our own identities. Often we think it's the opposite. We see dialogue as something that chips away at our identity. No, I'd say, in fact, it's because of dialogue, I come out strengthened in my own identity, more sure of myself, but with the assurance that with that person, you know, I can live together with them. We can cohabit this earth, and I discover something deeper, something profoundly human that binds us. And it makes me really understand why we're Christian, and just how, as a Christian, we can be a friend and a brother of everyone. You were going to cite first a quote. You know, I'll just round things up now. I wanted to end with a quote, and it was something that struck me. This kind of the final stroke I'll deliver is a quote from Giussani. Obviously, just I'll play it safe here. I know my audience. And what I'd read here, I'll tell you now, it struck me because, you know, I was thinking for a few things today of two kind of reasons for which, you know, Giussani said, as I said this morning, he said, I would cry, and I'll just say this quickly. During one of his first trips between 61 and 62, Giussani met a group of missionaries in Friuli near Macapá, and one of these priests was called Father Bigliaghi. He was a huge guy, and one evening he tells him, come with me, and we'll to go and visit one of the communities here, and in the hinterlands. And he replied with a smile, slightly ironic, but I said yes, I agreed to go with him. I went with him to this community, and after a few hours driving, the car stopped and it had to turn around, and we had to get there in 8 hours. It was already getting late, and there was so many flies and mosquitoes everywhere that it would blow you up like a balloon. And the priest there, Father Biaghi, says he put on his wellies, who came all the way up to his knees, and then that's kind of when he started understanding. He started to enter into the quagmire that came up to his ankles, and it took you a minute to walk just a meter, and I was there. I saw him kind of plodding further away, and he would look behind him, he'd say hi, he'd smile with the same old smile, and the sun was due to set in a quarter of an hour, so I saw him far off, and he was surrounded by this kind of cloud of insects, and after 8 hours there was someone in there kind of drawing out the sap from trees, and Giussani said he'd never forget that image. He says, I always tell my friends this story. I must have been stood there at least half an hour just without moving, thinking, well, is this Christianity? Look at what it is. This man who risks his skin literally to go and see one single man, a man he'd never even met before, maybe a guy he probably would never even ever see again in his life. In that moment, he wanted to go and talk to him. I had a vivid perception of the idea that Christianity was born specifically as love for your fellow man. I hope that both I and you can share in that same passion.
No, l'applauso chiaramente.
You know, the applause is obviously for Giussani, not for me. Go on, you're right to applaud. It's surely an applause for Giussani, but also for you, Your Eminence, for the friendship that you live with us, and you know, even with your deep passion that you brought with us today, both your own and that of Giussani. Surely we'll be accompanying you with our prayers in this great journey you have ahead of you.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Mi ricordo il giorno che siamo partiti per il nostro viaggio. Anche se è stato molto tempo fa. Già allora avevamo grandi obiettivi. Volevamo contribuire al progresso del nostro paese e renderlo un posto sempre migliore. E ci siamo impegnati ogni giorno per farlo. Come in tutti i viaggi, strada facendo il nostro bagaglio si è riempito. Di ricordi, di emozioni, di esperienza. Ogni persona che abbiamo incontrato ha contribuito a rendere la nostra squadra più forte. Passo dopo passo abbiamo camminato sempre più veloce per avvicinarci al futuro. Dopo 60 anni il nostro percorso continua insieme. Verso un domani migliore. 60 anni di futuro e di energia.
Perché l'aspettavano così?
Perché credo in quello che dico.
Questo e basta?
Sì.
Don Giussani ha generato un popolo e io faccio parte di questo popolo.
L'avvenimento in cui Dio entra nella nostra esistenza e tutti, colpiti da una curiosità, sospendono per un istante l'ora e guardano dalla parte da cui viene il grido.